first walked into the National Archives in Sierra Leone, I passed through a heavy blue door and stepped into a different world from the bustle and chaos of Freetown outside. It's cooler inside, but not by much, but the oppressive humidity fades slightly. There's the smell of old paper and dust. Old bound volumes line the shelves, filled with neat, precise handwriting from people long dead. As I paged through these volumes, dominated by the words and actions of men, I started to despair of finding women's voices and stories. But then I found a handwritten letter on blue paper. The ink had faded over time, parts were barely legible, sections were blurred and damaged by water. The document was fragile, partly destroyed, but still told a story. In 1884, a chief wrote to the British District Commissioner in Sierra Leone. Several of his wives, he complained, had disappeared. They had loaded his possessions into a canoe and left. Their actions carried real risk. If they had been captured and returned, the consequences would have been severe and likely violent. We don't know much about these women. History didn't preserve their names, their ages, or what happened after they left. We can make educated guesses based on other records. They may have been junior wives, their marriages arranged by their parents. They may have fallen out of the chief's favor for reasons we can only imagine. There may have been rivalries with other wives that made daily life unbearable. And some may have been enslaved women given to the chief as tribute or taken in spoils of war. Although the district commissioner looked for the women, they were not found, and a month later he found the canoe and returned it. This tiny fragment of paper that signals a moment of historical disruption tells us two things. Firstly, that women acted. They took control of their situations, even within a system designed to contain them. And second, that the colonial state, alongside local elites, mobilized to stop them. You might ask yourself, so what is the big deal about women running away from their husbands? That's hardly news. Women leave husbands all the time. At this moment, we should pause to unpack this even further. Why was a district commissioner, a colonial government official, who was probably a busy man, spending his time looking for another man's wife and retrieving stolen property? The story does not only tell us about the woman, but also provides insight into how the colonial government functioned in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is often celebrated in British history as an early symbol of abolition. But the period I'm describing, slavery was still legal. In fact, it was not abolished until 1928. This means these women were not running away from a system that had ended. They were running away from one that was still being actively organized and entrenched. British officials were stretched thin and did not want to spend the money on building up an effective administration. Sierra Leone was not a prestigious posting like South Africa or India. As one observer remarked, many officials arrived drunk and only got drunker. It was also dangerous. Malaria and other diseases killed many officials. So while colonial authorities publicly condemned slavery, they relied heavily on a slave-owning elite to govern. Through these intermediaries, they claimed to preserve pre-colonial systems of authority, although in reality, they were redefining and institutionalizing them in new ways. One key institution within this system was the household. And within this system, wives and enslaved women were key elements. Their hands worked to sustain it. A woman's ability to bear children reproduced it. It was this system that entrenched power and patriarchy. Marriage and slavery were not separate institutions in the house. Many women were both wives and enslaved, and placing them within a complex and overlapping systems. Both wives and enslaved women were seen as legally disabled and under the control of patriarchal structures that granted men exclusive sexual access to their bodies. Another similarity was that both wives and enslaved people were outsiders brought into a household. They were outsiders within, whose position was initially that of a stranger and over time could become integrated as an important member of the house. But over time, their relationship status could change, but only through the strength of their relationship with their owner or husband. However, there is one critical difference between the two, and that is the concept of social death. Social death was to be cut off from the web of relationships that made you human. Your friends, your family, and community who knew your name, your history, your worth. The further a person was taken from home, the less protection they could claim. Violence was not incidental to the system, it was foundational. Punishments were considered legitimate because they were inflicted by an owner upon property. Survival depended on a single, fragile relationship with a master. The point is this: you were alive because someone else allowed you to be. When your life depended entirely on another person's permission, you were no longer recognized as a person at all. You were reduced to a thing. Wives, even when badly treated, were not entirely without recourse. Their marriages placed them within a network of recognition. There were kin who could intervene, family members who could protest, elders who may step in if things went too far. However constrained their lives, they were still acknowledged as human beings embedded in relationships. They had names, histories, people who could claim them, and that recognition mattered. It meant that suffering did not automatically erase their personhood. Even in a painful or unjust situation, they were not alone in this world. They remained someone whose life carried social weight. And this is why the canoe matters. When those women pushed off from the shore in 1884, they were not simply running away from a household. They were rejecting a system that claimed the power to decide whether they could live as a person or only as property. They were rowing towards recognition, towards community, towards the restoration of their own humanity. So now we understand why the canoe is important. But to grasp the full significance of the act, we need to recognize something else. Most women's lives do not enter the archive. Most acts of refusal, negotiation, endurance, and escape were never written down. Therefore, the fact that these women did demands explanation. Continuity rarely leaves a trace, but disruption does. These disruptions are what are known as archival pulses, a moment where power falters just enough to become visible. On the surface, it was a domestic dispute, but entered the archive because the household could not contain it. Runaway wives were not simply a private matter. They were a political problem. The colonial order depended on women staying put, and when women moved, the system moved to stop them. That is why a district commissioner, a representative of empire, found himself tracking down missing women recovering a canoe. What survives in the archive is not the women's voices, but two men writing to each other about loss, about property, authority, and disorder. Women appear only as the subject of their exchange. And this is the deeper problem. The written record was never designed to preserve women's voices. From the earliest Arabic sources to European travel writers, African history was overwhelmingly recorded as men's affairs. Women entered the archive in fragments, as princesses, chiefs' mothers, slaves, and concubines. Their voices were not only shadowed by the voices of men, but submerged between the racist and dehumanizing language of colonial officials and missionaries, language that reduced them to symbols of barbarism or moral disorder, and at times threatened to erase them altogether. My faded blue document might look unremarkable, a brittle sheet of colonial paper covered in official handwriting, filed and forgotten. It does not record a woman's voice in her own words. It does not preserve a speech, a testimony, or a confession. What it preserves is an action. This is where Ehud Toledano's work becomes so useful. Writing about slavery in the Ottoman Empire, Toledano argues that actions speak louder than words, should be the central mantra of any historical research. Voice needs not be confined to written or spoken testimony. It can be located in practice. While evidence of what enslaved people said is often scarce, evidence of what they did is frequently more abundant. And as Toledano reminds us, action and intention are often inseparable. This approach does not claim to reconstruct women's voices in any pure or unmediated sense. Instead, it traces patterns of action, constraint, and negotiation as they appear, often indirectly, within the archival record. And when we keep that in mind, something changes. What we see in the archive is striking. Women are running away, and colonial chiefs and colonial officials were failing to stop them. When women ran away, they destabilized the foundations of political power. The departures were frequent enough to alarm chiefs. One chief reportedly abandoned his entire capital because soldiers were taking his wives. Complaints multiplied across the protectorate. The language casts women as victims of abduction, but it also reveals something else: anxiety about losing control. These were not isolated kidnappings, although some undoubtedly were. Young women were meeting young men, sought better treatment, sought greater provisions. Some were escaping from neglect, and others were trying to make lives for themselves. But we need to be careful about how we describe these women's actions. Too often we reduce women's actions to questions of consent or coercion, as if those were stable, opposing categories, as if action must be one or the other. In reality, the line between them was really clear. Consent was really a single, free act of choice. It was shaped by conditions that limited the capacity to refuse. As Karl Marx observed, people make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please, but under circumstances directly found, given, and transmitted from the past. Women acted within circumstances they did not choose. Read carefully, archival fragments reveal that these negotiations showed how women recalibrated authority, even when they could not dismantle it. The canoe was powerful, yes. It carried women away from a system that denied their personhood. It forced officials to notice. It left a trace in the archive. But it did not overturn the structures of slavery or patriarchy. The web of domination remained largely intact. For every canoe that reached the shore, countless others never left, or left no record behind. The act mattered not because it transformed the whole system overnight, but because it revealed its fragility. It showed that even within systems built on oppression, people continue to act, to calculate, to move. The canoe does not tell us that power disappeared. It tells us that power was never absolute. But the sheer frequency of movement unsettles any narrative of total domination. Women were not simply compelled to remain. Their mobility reveals negotiation, dissatisfaction, and aspiration woven into everyday life. Through these descriptions, we hear a moral language of fairness and belonging. Status was understood through lived experience: those who labored, who were fed, who were clothed, and who was neglected. We see this most clearly in rare moments when women's voices do surface in the archive. When they speak, they do not offer sweeping manifestos. They are not proclaiming revolutions or declaring abstract rights. Instead, they talk about the texture of the everyday, about mistreatment, about hunger, about quarrels, about fear. These fragments mattered precisely because of their ordinariness. They remind us that mobility was not always framed as heroic resistance. It was often about the practical negotiations of daily existence, about making life bearable, more secure, more recognizably human. We see this most clearly in the way people explained what made someone enslaved or free. In several slave trading cases, women insisted that they were not wives but slaves, because, as one put it, he used to buy clothes for his wife, but not for me. In that distinction, simple, material, concrete, lies a profound judgment about power, obligation, and worth. And this is what action looks like. Not always protest, not always rebellion, not always resistance. Sometimes it's leaving, sometimes it's refusing, sometimes it's choosing to live differently within constraint. These women were not outside the system, they were navigating it. Their choices were shaped by an equal power and limited possibilities. Yet their movement unsettled households, alarmed chiefs, mobilized colonial officials, and left paper behind. And this paper is still with us. The canoe is proof of that. It did not come with a speech or a manifesto. It arrived as movement, as bodies crossing water, as absence from a household, as a problem political authorities felt compelled to record. And yet, that single act forced itself into the archive. It altered the paperwork. It disturbed the order of things. And in doing so, it ensured that those women, though never fully heard, could not be erased entirely. Thank you.